So for my presentation today, I'm doing the false consensus effect, an egocentric bias in social perception and attribution processes by Lee Ross, David Green, and Pamela House. The first thing that we have to look at is the false consensus effect, which is that average people tend to see their own behavioral choices as relatively more common for the general public and appropriate to the existing circumstances, while they view alternative responses as uncommon, deviant, and inappropriate for that set of circumstances. And that also the false consensus effect is also relative to what the person sees. That's why you'll have some people thinking that something is more common and some people thinking that something else is more common when in reality it may not be aligned with what they think. The main research issues of the false consensus effect is to demonstrate that the generalizability of the false consensus is pretty big and that the false consensus effect happens to everyone. The other research issue is that they want to explore the implications of our understanding of the social perception phenomena and the often divergent perceptions of actors and observers, such that they just want to look at how people form impressions of and make inferences about other people and how it differs from regular thinking. The first hypothesis is that people will rate what they chose as more probable than those who chose the alternative. And the second hypothesis is that people will rate trait responses with less extreme and confident ratings for a typical person than a person who chose the alternative. So the person who chose the alternative uh, hypothetical choice will have a more extreme response according to the Likert rating scale. So for study one, the authors used 320 undergrad students that were split up into four different groups of 80 participants each. So the independent variable that they were looking at were the four different categories or brief stories. These were the supermarket, the term paper, the traffic ticket, and the space program referendum. So these stories were all hypothetical to just try and get the person thinking about it. And for example, in the supermarket scenario, the participants were asked a few questions of why they shopped there. Then, after they're asked a few questions, they're asked to sign a waiver allowing their responses to be used in a media campaign for that supermarket. And right after that, then the questions that they would be asked were consensus questions, such as what percent of your peers do you estimate would sign the release, and what percent would refuse to sign it? And this happened like This happened for each of the four different categories, and then uh, and they're just to see what kind of consensus they would be able to find within the different groups. Again, so when you're looking at it, each participant was asked to estimate the percentage of their peers who would choose each of the two possible courses of action, such as signing the release or refusing to sign it. Then, after they were asked the consensus questions, they were then asked to fill out a 3-page questionnaire. The order of the 3 pages varied, so it was kind of like a random assignment. And what happened was that uh, for the first person, page one was about which choice they would choose and rating that choice using the Likert scale. Then pages two and three were about the participants who, like the traits of the participants of a typical person who would choose to sign the form, or and then on page three would be of the traits of a typical person who would not sign the form. And both of these were also measured on the Likert scale again, which the Likert scale is just kind of like the example of how satisfied are you with school? Somewhat satisfied, very satisfied, not satisfied, very dissatisfied, and neither here nor there. That's what a Likert scale is. So for the results of study one, they found that the initial study offered strong support for the first hypothesis. That being that they found that participants tended to rate the general population as more probable of making the same decision as the participant as opposed to making the opposite decision. Uh, this can mainly be seen, for example, in the supermarket story on the table located to the right. Under option one, you have a 75.6 versus 24.4. This shows that when a person decided to sign the release, they estimated that the typical person would also sign the release. Although, when you look at for not signing the release, the option two is a bit smaller, showing that there's a negative correlation. But then uh, for some of the other hypothetical things, you also see that uh, it goes in the way, such as in the space program. You have, for the vote against, you have the bigger number in option two saying that it will be more typical for a person to vote against cutback. And then if you go all the way down to the summary of the four stories, you'll find that if you choose option one will have option one would be like to sign the release. It has a bigger number under the option one column than option two. And then for the summary of the four stories under choose option two, you'll see that the bigger number is under the column option two than it is for option one, showing that there is some support that people tend to rate the general population as more probable of making the same decision as themselves. Furthermore, in the second part of the study, so for the second hypothesis, there was some support for it. They found that the first two stories had statistical significance, the third story had slight significance, and the fourth was trivial. This can be seen in Table 2, where For people who said they would sign the release under the supermarket story, the option number two, which is the opposite of what they said, was rated as being more extreme. And then under the not sign the release, option one was more extreme because it's the opposite. So these two first stories, they just gave uh, strong statistical significance for the hypothesis, whereas number three, are not as uh, the numbers aren't as big, so it offered a little bit less. And then for study four, it was trivial because there is almost no variation within some of the numbers. Um, and so by this, they also found that both behavioral consensus and trait inferences are influenced by the rater's own behavioral choices. Um, and they found all of this just from conducting the first study and looking at all these numbers. So for study two, they just wanted to kind of push the study one a little bit further than what it's already gone. So this study was done to show that people overestimate the extent to which others share their views. Um, so when they went to do this study, they had 80 undergraduate students, which they all completed a 35 item questionnaire uh, with a lot of the questions being in different categories such as like shy versus not shy, um, and a whole bunch of other just different questions. So and they also were looking at what kind of percentage the participant would give when they're asked a certain question. And so the hypothesis for this study was that the participants would rate a higher percentage of the general population as having the same views as the participant. So this is why they're trying to measure what percentage the participants gave. As I mentioned before, the different item categories can be seen to the table on the right, such as the shy, not shy, and all of these were just given percentages by the participants who either agreed with it or didn't agree. So what happened was that they found that the participants consistently estimated the percentage of the typical person to be greater in the same category as they placed themselves. Uh, this happened for 32 of the 34 groups. And before I mentioned that there was 35 groups, but one of the groups they didn't think the question was appropriate for the study, so they decided to take it out. And they also found that the effect applies to many different aspects, but that they're unsure of the limit of the false consensus effect. This being that they still haven't found a way to measure how far it actually goes, even though they know it goes over many different characteristic types. Studies three and four, they're meant to kind of validate study one because study one was completely hypothetical and was just done with a questionnaire. Um, and they wanted to prove the relevance of study one, just then assume that it was relevant. So studies three and four were done uh, kind of together, where study three was a hypothetical scenario that asked participants to choose one of two choices and then rate the dispositions of the general person who might choose that choice. And then study four kind of brought this to life. So instead of being hypothetical, it brought the participants into the situation that was described to them in study three. Um, and then in study four, they also had to make trait assessments about people whom they had additional information from. This information comes from the when the participants have to fill out a likes and dislikes chart. This will allow a person to kind of base uh, if they actually signed it or they didn't sign it kind of thing. So study 3 had 104 participants reading one of two different versions of the story and then asked for consensus estimates. And then study 4 had 80 participants in groups of 2 to 5 fill out a likes and dislikes chart, and then they fulfilled the hypothetical scenario of study 3. In addition, the authors also hypothesized that participants would perceive a false consensus for own behavioral choices regardless of whether the study was hypothetical or real, and that trait assessments would be distorted by participants' own behavioral choices, views, thoughts, beliefs, and it would just kind of give a little bit more explanation to the false consensus. They found that both hypothetical and real studies supported the false consensus effect. They also found that those who wore or refused to wear the sign had the same false consensus that their decision was the most common. This can be seen uh, in the first part of the table to the right, under the Eat at Joe's, where if a person decided to wear the sign, they said that the percentage of subjects who would wear a sign was greater than the percentage who would not wear a sign. And for the participants who did not wear the sign, they said that those who would not wear the sign is greater than those who would wear the sign, showing that they had a false consensus that most people would agree with their views. Furthermore, they found that trait influence reflected and were influenced by personal responses. They also found that there were strong inferences about the traits of the typical person of the opposite group, and that there was weak inferences about the traits of a typical person of the same group as the participant chose. Um, this can be seen in, uh, again, the Eat at Joe's. If you go under the not wear sign, you'll find that uh, when they rated a person wearing a sign, it was a lot stronger about, like, there's a lot stronger inferences about the traits of a person who would wear a sign than those who would not wear a sign. Whereas for if you were to go under the wear sign, there's weaker inferences under wear and wear than under wear and not wear. And this just goes to show that there's some influences that can reflect and influence uh, the person's rating ability. They also found that one's own behavior on trait inferences is not limited to hypothetical scenarios, because they also found the exact same results in the study 4, which was now the real component or the in life component of study 3. And the results kind of showed the exact same thing, that under where and where, it's a weaker inference than under where and not where. And then under not where and where, it's stronger than under not where and not where it's a weaker inference about the person's trait. In conclusion, it can be said that people's own consensus about others reflects their own behavioral choices and judgments about specific people. It can also be said that the false consensus effect is generalizable to everyone, and it does not only pertain to hypothetical scenarios, but is also like it also pertains to real scenarios and can be applied in almost any situation. When was the last time that you have thought that someone might agree with you and you had a differing opinion from them? Well, for me, it happened last semester. Me and one of my friends, we were talking about a subject, and what happened was that I thought that he would have had the exact same opinion as me, and we had differing opinions. And I thought that a lot more people would probably agree with me I than I initially thought because I thought it was just a common view. But then when he told me that he had a different idea, then I actually had to start thinking about uh, how many other people have I been assuming has the exact same view or exact same choices as me and actually doesn't. So this kind of just shows a simple example of the false consensus effect where I prematurely gave a person a specific view, or I put a specific percentage out there that a certain amount of people would probably agree with me if I said such a statement. And turns out that I was wrong. This is just kind of one of the small things that you don't really think about day to day, but it happens all the time.